Recently, there's been an increase in violence in Northern Ireland. Dissident Republicans have been blamed for ugly clashes with police that have resulted in some of the worst rioting Belfast has seen for years. But what's causing this resurgence? The big story is in Northern Ireland to find out why this is happening now and what can be done to stop it.
There has been a dramatic reduction in violence to the point that when anything happens now, it comes as a significant shock to people because it disturbs that degree of tranquility that has become part of people's lives.
I think that behind these groups of young people, there may well be community tensions at adult level.
A lot of it is about giving the kids an opportunity to become friends, because hatred is something that's taught. You aren't born hating people. You're actually taught that hatred. And so if hatred can be taught, then it can be untaught.
"13 years ago, the Good Friday Agreement, a crucial landmark in the peace process, was signed here. It paved the way for the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin to begin a power-sharing agreement in 2007. But despite these attempts at equal partnership, there remain tensions between the Protestant and the Catholic communities they represent. The traditional July parades of the Unionist Orange Order have always caused friction, and in the past it was not unusual for nationalists to arrange large, violent riots in response. This has been on the decrease in recent years, as there's no longer widespread support for it amongst the public, and none at all from the political parties. There is a small minority of nationalists who continue to believe in aggression as the means to further their cause. But lately, these clashes with the police have featured an alarming number of young people as well. Some claim that their presence is down to antisocial behavior as much as anything else. So why has this problem resurfaced so abruptly? What caused the recent riots?
Well, unfortunately, the summer months always tend to be a time of tension here in Northern Ireland. The parades, the Orange Order parades, the Apprentice Boys parades, do cause tensions. They caused less tensions now than they did in 10 years or so ago. But you can look back through Northern Irish history, and this is not something that's just related to the conflict. Parades have caused tensions for the last 200 years. We know that the marching season is a time of tensions, and realistically it's working out ways to try to manage those tensions better. And if you compare this year with last year, that perhaps there were more areas where there were acts of violence, rioting. If you compare it with 10 years ago, it's a lot fewer.
Well, some of it is just simple antisocial behaviour, kids who are bored and want to do something. In other parts of the world, that's just is becoming involved in some minor crime. Here it involves rioting, and that is not something that's minor. On every occasion it has the potential for somebody to be killed or very seriously injured. And it does tremendous damage to the image of Northern Ireland around the world, and damages things like our tourist industry as well. But it is also on the back of a deep-seated sectarianism. That sectarianism is born out of bad religion. It's born out of a bad sense of identity promoted by two groups, both exclusive rather than that inclusive concept of identity that works in most societies and most societies aspire to. It's about social issues, and it's about bad politics that continues to press divisive buttons rather than actually promoting a type of politics that brings people together.
Some communities have grown with this peace and others have not. And there is an issue, particularly within some Protestant loyalist neighbourhoods, of this sentiment that they haven't benefited from the peace. So they still have those frustrations, anxieties and concerns, and unfortunately they manifest themselves in violence sometimes.
I think we're terribly grateful that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have recognised that there is a need for them to investigate what the causes might be, whether they be of a deprivation of a particular nature or of a particular type, whether it be a lack of education, a lack of job opportunities. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have set in motion a process and have appointed a team of people to investigate this.
There has been a dramatic reduction in violence to the point that when anything happens now, it comes as a significant shock to people because it disturbs that degree of tranquility that has become part of people's lives.
I think one of the things that's different now from a few years ago is that violence still occurs, but it doesn't tend to spread like wildfire across other parts of the city. It's brought under control much more quickly. So, for example, the rioting in the Ardoyne this year lasted for one night. It was brought under control. It didn't spread to any other parts of the city, and it hasn't led to any kinds of retaliation in the days and weeks since. So yes, it's a persistent problem, but what we're getting much better at is managing it and keeping it under control.
I see it as something in the nature of an aftershock, not an inevitable part of life, but something that from time to time we must be prepared to expect as part of this transition to a more steadily and securely peaceful future.
Murals like this exist all across Belfast, depicting Unionist, or on this occasion, Republican sentiments. But do the young people who are surrounded by these messages every day have any real idea of their significance? The recent rioting involved a lot of young people who would not remember the bad old days. How have they become involved in this situation?
I think there's really two main elements. Yes, there's some elements of it being people being encouraged, being manipulated into being involved in that level of violence. But there's also very clearly a sense in which it's exciting. You know, it's good fun to get involved, and once you know the rules of being involved, the risk either of being injured or being arrested is very low, and therefore people participate because it's a good entertainment. It's an adrenaline rush. So I think there's some people are being manipulated, some people are being encouraged, some people are quite happy to participate in it.
What do young people tell you is wrong? What are they challenged by?
Well, some of the issues that they're challenged by are simply that they're bored and they get involved in some minor criminality. But as I said, in Northern Ireland that takes on a different form, where people with a darker agenda actually end up having an influence upon them and dragging into some serious violence, street violence that we've seen recently. But if it is those issues, then that is simply a matter that society starts engaging with them and saying, right, how can we tackle this issue that you're bored, that you've nothing to do, that you feel you've no chance of getting a job, and giving them an aspiration for something better in the future.
Is this a recreational thing? These kids wouldn't have known about life in the Troubles. Why are they there?
No, I think you're quite right in that respect. But I think that behind these groups of young people, there may well be community tensions at adult level. There will be those who in the past have perhaps had some greater element of influence over the society in which they live. And as society normalizes, they may be finding that they are actually losing that.
These young people are being used, by those in the community for their own selfish ends. And it undermines a lot of really good work that takes place in communities, by legitimate community leaders, if I may say that, by those who are trying to bring their entire community with them. So it is a constant struggle.
For some people, there's a nostalgia for the conflict. For some of those young people, there's a nostalgia for something they didn't really know about, but have read about, and there's an assumption of the whiff of excitement that goes around with it. I think for a lot of the older generation, though, it's exactly the opposite. That was then, and we can rationalise about why we did it then, but we certainly don't want to go back there. We certainly don't want our kids participating in that sort of stuff. We don't want that sort of stuff affecting our areas. And I think the fact that we've had 17 years now away from the armed conflict, most people see that as a line in the sand. They don't want to go back to that. That's why the dissident groups don't have much support here. They have enough to keep themselves going, but they have nothing really to build on. They have no popular support. Most people, do not want to go back to violence.
It is, of course, the role of the police to try and keep things under control when violence does break out. But what is the state of community relations?
Where we see most of the trouble emanating from is in areas where two communities are only the width of a street apart, and where there is a likelihood that one could attack the other. And we find that the police are brought into the middle of this to try to, use an expression, if I may, hold the line and keep the two communities apart, and to try to minimise the amount of damage that one side could inflict on the other.
What is the current state of cross-community relations in Northern Ireland?
Well, generally they're not bad at the moment. They are certainly a lot better than they have been in a few years ago. They're generally improving. It's by no means the same across the board. It takes work on both sides to improve those relationships and to maintain those improvements. So that paradoxically, in parts of Belfast where the communities are most divided, it's also the areas where you've got better relationships between sections of the communities because they're forced to engage in discussion and dialogue.
How would you assess the relationship between the police and the community right now?
I think that in general, right across Northern Ireland, the vast majority of people have a good relationship with policing. Unfortunately, that is not representative of a certain number of pockets within the city here in Belfast and in other parts of Northern Ireland, both up in the northwest and down around border areas where trouble has been brewing. And I think that the police do the very best that they can in the circumstances that they find themselves.
Although communities may no longer have as much of an appetite for fighting each other, neighbouring streets can still live separate lives, with people rarely coming into contact with the other side. The segregation of some services, particularly schools, does not help matters.
Well, part of the problem with the conflict that we went through in Northern Ireland, it ended up with a balkanised Northern Ireland. So you have pockets of red, white and blue, green, white and gold with different ethnic groups of our society living apart. So we still have the peace walls in existence in Belfast, for example, and we have the non-visible peace walls that exist throughout the whole of Northern Ireland. And it's the challenge is, how do we start bringing those down? How do we start getting people to meet, getting people to know each other better, breaking down those barriers and building the sort of relationships that exist in most societies?
Those who express any doubt or difficulty about sharing a neighbourhood, sharing a workplace, sharing a friendship, sharing a family relationship with people from the other tradition are in the 2, 3, 4% of the population. 95% plus are entirely happy with the notion of increased sharing. Now, there are some striking facts, of course. One is that people live separately. More than 90% of social housing is more than 90% segregated. Children go to different schools. They play different games. They hear different versions of the history of Northern Ireland. They socialise in different places. It perhaps is only when they go to work or they go to third level education that they properly begin to engage with people from a background different from their own.
One of the most surprising things in our trip here has been the way in which the community lives two separate lives. 90% of schools are separate communities. Leisure centres are different. You'd ever meet somebody from the other side until tertiary education. Surely there's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody can attempt to defend it. It is one of the long-standing problems in Northern Ireland. I think particularly education, having a divided education system, helps perpetuate those senses of division and separation that underpin this society.
Our schools, we still have too many people being educated separately. And that is something then we rest of us have to sort of plaster over the crack that creates in our society. And so what we need is, if we can't bring the schools together, then we need to ensure that at a lot younger level that our kids get an opportunity to meet each other and get to know each other. So we share education, not necessarily in one school, but the schools actually have an obligation to make sure that the kids maybe play in sports teams together, maybe put on concerts together, go to classes together on maybe specific subjects. That there are real policies that can be implemented that would actually make an issue. And a lot of it is about giving the kids an opportunity to become friends. Because hatred is something that's taught. You aren't born hating people. You're actually taught that hatred. And so if hatred can be taught, then it can be untaught.
On the positive side, you can say that in the way we've moved since the beginning of the conflict, since the early 70s, the workplace is much less segregated. The workplace is generally a neutral environment. Some of the big urban centres, centre of Belfast, is a neutral environment. You don't see it marked out with flags and colours. People generally feel able and capable of mingling in those areas. And research that we've done over the last few years has indicated that that's fairly widespread, that people feel comfortable shopping in shared spaces, some forms of socialising. Of course, there's certain times of the year when those patterns go out the window. When you come to the marching season, people revert to segregated areas more readily. But I think we can say that there has been considerable improvements in some areas, but with the proviso that we still have a segregated education system. We still have residential areas, particularly in Belfast, which are heavily segregated and heavily divided, and we haven't made much progress in addressing those issues.
But if there is a desire for a greater level of space sharing, and it is acknowledged as a way forward to keep violence from returning, what is preventing the disassembly of Northern Ireland's segregated services?
We're talking about two separate communities in one space.
Yes, I mean, this developed over the years of the Troubles. So there is some reason, logical reason why this happened. There's, in the case of West Belfast, for example, you have two leisure centres that are probably within half a mile of each other. And the reason that is because for the longest time, one would not expect Catholics to go to the leisure centre in a Protestant-populated neighbourhood, and vice versa. And that was understandable. But if we're in a peace environment now, then why are we continuing to waste this money? I mean, should we not be focusing our efforts and trying to reconcile communities, improve safety and security, so that we can have anyone from any community go to any leisure centre? I mean, if that's what I mean. If we had that kind of vision, this is where we want to go, we need to save, some money, stop this wastage, then, we could then decrease segregation, and improve social cohesion. But so long as the politicians don't give anyone that kind of direction, then, the wastage is going to continue.
If the answer for you is such an obvious one, why hasn't it been done?
I think it's a disgrace it hasn't happened. I think it's sitting there. It's all sitting there. And I see it. I talk to various groups. I've gone into the prison and talked to the young people and asked them about the issues. They say they go into prison, they come out of prison, they go back in amongst their peer group, and so they end up reoffending. I see good prison officers, good governors of prison who want something done. I see the probation board doing fantastic work, and the Prince's Trust doing great work over here. I see many community groups doing fantastic work, and yet there doesn't seem to be that coordination at a governmental level to actually really pull it all together so that it works far better than what it actually does at the minute. And it is the politicians need to actually grasp the concept of working together and actually getting a sort of a shared executive working across the whole executive to try and address these issues. It's sitting there and it's all there, and you've good people doing their jobs in their own specific areas, and what you need is better coordination of that, and that's for the politicians to actually start bringing out in our society. And the responsibility starts with them, that they have to grab this and actually make it far more effective than what it is at this moment in time, because there is really some very good work out there and innovative, and will make a real difference if given the leadership that it needs.
until fairly recently, I've been very critical of politicians. I think they've tended to serve very much as tribal leaders rather than as statesmen, stateswomen. And I think it's only over the last couple of years that we've started to see some inclination that people are prepared to act as leaders for the whole community. But it's by no means a complete break with the past.
There are areas, for example, interface areas, where for the longest time, a wall has separated two adjoining communities, and where, a survey of the local people would say, yes, we're ready for this wall to be taken down, but only if, say, there's traffic calming measures, because we don't want joyriders, teenagers running their cars up and down the street. And what is the response by the government is that, well, in order to put the traffic calming measures, we'd have to do a survey and it'll take a year. That's not a conversation. I mean, that's just stupidity as far as I see, where government officials are not getting the bigger picture. That if there is some local leadership, if the local communities if they're ready, no one's forcing any local communities to get on. But if they're ready to have the conversation, please, let's have this conversation and come up with some sensible policies.
This lethargy by the political class is all the more stark when compared to the efforts of some individuals and small groups to create a more inclusive society.
To me, one of the best examples of that was the Irish Football Association in Northern Ireland, that they recognised that in the mid-90s their game was being destroyed by sectarianism taking over the terraces at Northern Ireland football matches. And they realised it was alienating people from going to their game. The team, you could see, was uncomfortable with the atmosphere that was created there. And so the fans who loved the game, they loved their team, looked at themselves and said, we're sectarian and we need to challenge ourselves here. And so they set about actually implementing policies that made a difference. They brought in new songs that were non-sectarian. They challenged those who tried to continue singing the old songs. The terraces used to be red, white and blue, and so they changed it to a sea of green, to the extent that a friend of mine who's a nationalist said, how can I not support a team that's so green? And they actually looked at challenging themselves, and suddenly fans, now you can't get a ticket for the matches, and the atmosphere is fantastic, and you can see the team really wanting to play for their fans. And that was leadership by the fans, and particularly through two people, Michael Boyd of the Irish Football Association and a guy, Jim Rainey, of the supporters. So it shows you that the issues that we have here can be actually tackled with good leadership.
Undoubtedly, Northern Ireland has come a long way since the Troubles, and the feeling is that recent incidents are not an indication of the country slipping back into that old pattern. The fact that rioting was brief and did not snowball into more severe clashes is proof of that. However, it does highlight that Northern Ireland is still healing deep rifts in its society, and will be doing so for years to come. Peace, after all, is a process.
The violence is definitely down, but peace isn't just the absence of violence. I mean, we need to actually make the most of the peace that we have. This is a golden opportunity for us to kind of move in a better direction. Because if we don't, then, what concerns me is that in 10, 15, 20 years' time, all the dissatisfaction could rear itself up in really ugly ways again. And we don't need that.